Hello, everyone. Good evening. This is Mika Santos on Part 8A, and this is our new episode today. We're talking about the recent August 31st protests and the current situation in Victoria as well. So, our guest for today is Dr. Simon Kaplan. He's a researcher at the Australian National University who is an expert in online extremism and male violence, as well as in the politics of social media and digital platform. He completed his PhD at Australian National University, which focused on the manosphere and online misogyny. And please welcome to the show, Dr. Simon Copland. Hi, Dr. Simon. How are you today?
Hi, thank you for having me on. I'm doing well. How about you?
Good, good. So my first question to you is this is we're talking about the sovereign citizen and also what happened um last Sunday. The
Mhm.
first question I have to you, Dr. Simon, is can you explain what is sovereign citizen movement is and how it differ from other anti-government or conspiracy movement in Australia?
Yeah, so good question. So I think it's important to note that the movement on Sunday for the March for Australia was made up of lots of different groups, and sovereign citizens are probably one part of that. Although probably not the organisers and the main people. In fact, we've seen a lot of neo Nazis who have really led a lot of those movements. But the sovereign citizen movement is also one that's gained prominence in Australia recently following the murder of a police officer in Victoria. So the sovereign citizen movement, it's a movement of people that really happens in common law, English-speaking common law countries like US, Canada, Australia, the UK, New Zealand. It started in the early 1970s. And basically, what these people believe is that the governments in these countries are illegitimate. Effectively, they believe that for governments to be legitimate, you have to personally sign up to them, and that in turn, they do not have to abide by the laws and the taxation system and these kinds of things for these governments. And so it's all based on pseudo legal ideas, legal ideas that aren't really true, but they believe that they shouldn't have to be part of governments of countries, and in turn that they can sort of avoid participating in or having responsibilities as part of a state. And I think that the movement then has a tendency to, by thinking that government is illegitimate, they tend to can go quite extreme and seek to do things like try to do citizens' arrests of government leaders, or at times can become quite violent, targeting because they believe that they're being persecuted, or they believe that they have the right to fight back against an quote unquote illegitimate government. You're still on mute there.
So the sovereign citizen movement has grown significantly in Australia since 2022. What factors contribute to the say expansion, particularly during and after COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that really happened around the sovereign citizen movement, and it's often hard to tell how these groups have grown or if they've grown, but it seems very clear that there are more sovereign citizens in Australia over the past number of years. The movement really started in the US, and there's certainly a growth in sovereign citizens in the US as well. But the main thing that certainly happened was the COVID-19 pandemic, and the government policies that followed that, particularly lockdowns, vaccine mandates, these types of things that were quite meaningful and serious government interventions in people's lives. And for lots of people, for the first time, possibly very seriously, they felt the impact, they felt the reality of governments intervening directly in their lives, and more so than just having to engage, for example, with the taxation system or engage, with legal matters. I think often people react strongly when the government starts to properly intervene in their lives. And that definitely happened to everybody in the COVID-19 pandemic. And the sovereign citizen movement capitalized on that and was able to sell to people who were dissatisfied with those policies, and there were lots of people who certainly were dissatisfied, that this pointed to the illegitimacy of the government. And we saw this particularly with a lot of the protests during the COVID-19 pandemic. I went to, as an observer, I went to the big Convoy to Canberra protest in early 2022, which was really about a lot of these policies, lockdowns, about vaccine mandates in particular. And it was driven very heavily by sovereign citizens, people who believed that the government was illegitimate, that they were engaging in illegitimate behaviour. There was a lot of calls, for example, for the Governor General to step in at that point of time and to sack the government, to do their job, to what they were saying. And there was a lot of conspiracy theories that followed about why the Governor General wasn't intervening at this point of time. And so it was driven by a lot of that, and that would have brought a lot of people into the movement.
Hmm, that's interesting. So, Dr. Kaplan, on August 31st, say March for Australia, rallies drew an estimated 15,000 people in Adelaide alone. Based on your research into we do on the far right movement, how significant were these numbers compared to previous anti-immigration demonstration in Australia?
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the images from the weekend were extremely scary for a lot of people, and those numbers were really terrifying. I was particularly surprised by the numbers in Adelaide, and I don't know what the factors were about why Adelaide had such high numbers, particularly because it looks like actually Adelaide had higher numbers than Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. The estimations now for Brisbane are under 10. Sorry, for Melbourne are now under 10,000. Similar for Sydney. And so it's interesting to understand why Adelaide was that outlier. I'm not quite sure. Um, there's two things happening here that I think are playing out. So I think that um, the movement is emboldened, and we saw this today actually with the leader of the neo-Nazi movement in Australia, Thomas Sewell, who just today accosted the Premier Jacinta Allen. Also, of course, the really horrendous violent attack on the sovereignty camp in Melbourne. The movement, in particularly in Melbourne, is emboldened, and they're becoming more violent, and that is a real concern. On the other side, however, I was somewhat pleasantly surprised that I think that the numbers were lower than they probably were expecting. They're claiming that there was 50,000 people in Melbourne. That's clearly not true. It's clearly was under 10,000. And if you compare it to, for example, the pro-Palestine protests that have happened, these numbers were well below, particularly some of the bigger ones that have happened recently. And it's worth thinking about it in the context of of the amount of media coverage that this event got. This event, the March for Australia, got mass media coverage, which I think was a mistake. I think that the mainstream media blew this up to be bigger than it should have been, and that probably encouraged more people to go on. It go along. It spread it. But even with that mass coverage, they got relatively small numbers compared to what I suspect they were hoping for. So it's kind of we're in this kind of interesting situation where I don't think that people are flocking to this movement, particularly like it happened in the United States or is happening in Europe, where far right leaders are taking, are literally taking government. But at the same time, we have a movement that is feeling emboldened, feeling like it can do things with impunity and feeling more violent, and that is a real threat. Because small numbers of people getting violent is a real threat to our society. And I think that's something we have to be very wary of, and something that we need to take action on to really intervene to stop that from happening.
So, the March for Australia organizers claim they have not invited the National Socialist Network to speak,
Mm.
yet this group appeared anyway. What does this tell us about coordination within Australia's far right ecosystem?
Well, it's really hard to believe some of those claims, actually. If you look in Melbourne, for example, Thomas Sewell, who is the head of the National Socialists, spoke at that event. So when you have people like that speaking at events, it's really hard to believe that you are not collaborating or coordinating with them. I think you have a situation here where organisers. So one of the things to say is that the March for Australia the organisation of it was clearly a shambles. It was announced They nobody took ownership of it. Then the neo Nazis tried to claim ownership of it, and then when the organizers saw the backlash for that, they then tried to backtrack. But it seems then they had a bunch of neo Nazis come along, and they didn't really feel comfortable. They weren't saying that they weren't invited either. The fact to the point you had people who were clearly had these views who were getting up and speaking and were invited to speak to participate. So it suggests that some of those organisers know that the neo Nazis are on their side, but want to pretend that they don't align, while at the same time. Sorry, my light just went out. Some of them, and then I think at the same time that they want to sort of gain those people, the people that come from the neo-Nazi movement. So uh, I suspect that they know that aligning with neo-Nazis is not seen as a is not seen as a good thing. That they don't want to be seen to be doing that, but they are a lot of their views of these organizers are still aligned with the neo-Nazis.
Mhm. Now, Dr. Kaplan, based on your research into online extremism, uh, and also the manospheres, how
Mhm.
do citizen group or this far right use digital platform to recruit and organize?
Yeah, so it's a really good question because I think that we do see that the far right is very good at organising online, and it's one of the things that we really need to learn from consistently to intervene as well as to potentially sometimes duplicate to for better causes. I mean, not to duplicate for those awful ideas. Um, they are very good at presenting material that is edgy. They're very good on getting on top of things, but they're particularly good at spreading disinformation and lies to create to whip up storms. And the thing to understand here is that social media is driven by attention. So social media companies want people to go there. They want people to look at it and spend lots of time on there. And often, our human psychology suggests that one of the ways you can keep people attention there is to make them angry. If you get people angry, they can go online. They'll spend their time. They'll engage with their anger, and it'll gives them opportunities to sort of get those endorphins basically from participating and being angry online. And the far right is extremely good at whipping up anger, and whipping up anger often for false things. They're very good at lying to whip up anger, but it creates this real sense. And the great example of this is what happened on the weekend. This idea of mass immigration, this idea of immigrants being the ones who are causing the housing crisis, for example, which all of the research, all the evidence suggests is just patently false. But if you say it enough, if you whip up the anger enough, it can spread like wildfire. So they do that very well. And I think that the final point to make here is that anger is easier to target when you can target particular individuals, particular groups of people. And that's exactly what's happening here. We're seeing them whip up anger targeted at scapegoats. In the US, it's often that anger is targeted both at immigrants. It's been increasingly targeted at LGBTIQ people. In the manosphere, that anger is targeted at women. In Australia, we're seeing an attempt to whip up that fear around immigrants here. That's what's happened on the weekend. They're whipping up a little bit of fear about LGBTIQ people. I know people who have gone, for example, to drag events to see people protesting at them now, and they're trying to copy these same things, really target scapegoated minority communities, and it's effective. And the social media platforms allow it to happen, and they're actually designed for it to happen.
Mm. So, as someone who study online, especially social media and extremism, did you observe connection between anti-immigration messaging and gender-based grievances during this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of connection between misogynistic ideas and racist ideas, I think is the easiest way to say it. And so in my PhD and my research, I really looked at men's rights movements and these misogynistic movements, but they're very clearly and deeply linked to anti-immigration movements in particular. So a classic example of this is in the United States. Where in the United States there's a movement called trad wives, and this is women who are wanting to quote unquote return to a traditional life. And for them, a traditional life means being the housewife. A strong belief in this movement about the need for women to be at home, to be subservient to her husband. People who are producing social media content where they're saying it's not okay for women to go out after dark without her husband. The women should be having children. Now, those ideas all strongly align with a lot of manosphere and misogynistic ideas um, that women should that we should go back to traditional relationships, whatever they mean by that, but tends to mean a traditional couple, man and wife, who where the woman is at home and the man's at work, and that those themes run very strongly through the manosphere. But the trad wife movement is not just about that. What it also about is it's also a very white supremacist movement, and it's a movement that is identifying people. It's driven by white women who are not just saying they want to go back to being at home to because they believe that's what women should do, but they also want to be at home and look after children because they believe that due to immigration, primarily due to demographic changes, that the quote unquote white nation of the United States, how they believe it, is being wiped out, and therefore it's the job of white women to be having lots of children to continue to ensure that there are white people in the US, that there's white dominance in the US. And so these ideas are very common. These things are very often interlinked. Um, we have a belief that to have a traditional lifestyle, which is often or traditional relationships, means not just going back to everybody of a multicultural society being men and women, but actually that we should go back to a non-multicultural society, that we should go back to white societies where there are white relationships, and part of that is also a belief in there that immigrants don't have those kind of values. A lot of really racist rhetoric targeted, for example, at Muslim immigrants. With this kind of idea that Muslims are all polygamists, or men will have multiple husbands, and therefore they don't suit, or they'll want to implement Sharia law, which doesn't suit the notion of what a white relationship should look like. So these things are very deeply interlinked, and so often people who are in these misogynistic movements are also very racist. That's not always true, but it's very, very connected.
Thank you so much for that. I just want to understand this what's happening for a simple person or
Hmm.
people, because Australia is diverse immigrant. Because of immigrant, the economy are flooding. So there are, and as I said, we are all immigrant because the original is First Nation is the actual own on the land of Australia. So I just want to understand why they are focusing on because of the immigrant, because of housing, but technically immigrant is the one helping.
Yep.
They are the one who paying taxes. They want, especially the student, like for example, the student, international student, most of them are coming, the revenue is coming from the student because
Yeah.
the tuition fee is higher than the
Yep.
local domestic student. So I just want to understand why this kind of understanding or what do we, mind like this.
Yep. Oh, it's a really good question, and you've highlighted a lot of the kind of hypocrisy of the movement, where you have people who are immigrants or who are recent immigrants or family members were immigrants who are then um, raging against immigration, and we saw that with late last week when the politician Bob Katter was asked about his Lebanese heritage. And he does have that Lebanese heritage. He's a grandfather or great grandfather moved to Australia from Lebanon. And when he asked that, he arced up and got very angry about it, almost coming across as being quite ashamed about that, and threatened to punch a journalist for raising that question. So it really points to the hypocrisy here. And everybody, you were right, everybody here, apart from the First Nations people, are immigrants, and so or descendants of immigrants. And so to claim that immigrants are the problem And often these groups are then also very racist towards First Nations people, even though we are the ones who are immigrants here. But to go to your question, what's going on here? I think that what we have, and the research is very clear about why does anti-immigration sentiment get whipped up, not just here but around the world. Um, and what frequently happens is you have people who are in some sort of distress, economic and social distress, and we're definitely seeing that in Australia with the cost of living crisis, increased costs, the housing crisis, the impacts of climate change. All of these things are putting distress on lots of communities, and frequently when these things happen, political actors can rise up to find easy scapegoats to blame for those problems. And sadly, the messaging about immigration, while often extremely patently false, and you've pointed out some of the falsities of that, are an easy story that we can sell. That your economic crisis, the housing crisis, it's caused by immigration. It's caused by immigrants, and that is an easy story to sell, and some people believe it. And when you have a social media sphere where it's really hard to cut through with the actual information, with the actual facts, or it's really hard to cut through to say, actually, it's not immigrants, it's political leaders who have done these housing policies, or it's big corporations who are getting more profits, that's what's causing the cost of living prices. It's really often easy for these political leaders to cut through with anti-immigration rhetoric. And one of the things I'd say there is that often these leaders who do this have ulterior motives in doing so. It was found out, for example, that one of the organisers of the March for Australia was the son of a major property developer. That property developer had and has. It was, when research was done, many, I think it was up to 30,000 empty properties across Australia, which they sit on to make money off. Now, that's the real cause of the housing crisis. That's one example of the real cause of the housing crisis. But those people have a motive to blame immigration, because then the attention is not placed on them. The attention is not placed on the property developers, who are the ones who are really causing this problem. And that's often a common trend with people trying to find scapegoats. It's a way to divert attention away from themselves and to put attention and blame onto somebody else.
Thank you so much for that. My last question, Dr. Kaplan, is looking ahead, what indicators should researchers, journalists, and policymakers monitor to assess whether movements like March for Australia are going mainstream traction or remaining fringe phenomenon?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. I think it's one that we have to be very wary of here in Australia. Um, what we're in a situation here in Australia where these movements in the US, in and Europe, have become extremely mainstream. And we have Donald Trump, who is conducting mass deportations, violent deportations in the US. You have in Europe neo-Nazi parties that are not just doing well, but are threatening to literally take power, and in some places have taken power. And not just in places like Germany, the historical roots of Nazism, who previously have said never again, are potentially heading in the direction of doing that again. We are lucky here that so far in Australia, and I'd say New Zealand as well, we are not at that stage. Pauline Hanson has been around for a very long time. She's probably the leader of these movements politically, and there's no threat of Pauline Hanson becoming a Prime Minister of Australia anytime soon. Although I'd warn that those things can change. So we're in a stage where the stuff is happening overseas, but we've held off so far here. But we have indicators that we should be keeping an eye on. So some of the first indicators are the support of those more fringe right-wing parties. So Pauline Hanson's One Nation, the Trumpets of Patriots, the Trumpet of Patriots, who Clive Palmer's group that appeared in the last election, and the Bob Carter Party, who's clearly sort of taking this anti-immigration stance. And one of my concerns is that all of those groups gained in their vote in the last election, although marginally. That is obviously a level of concern. The second one is we should keep an eye on polling around some of these topics, particularly around sentiments around immigration. And unfortunately, that is something where sentiment around immigration is heading in the wrong direction here in Australia. People are becoming more negative about immigration. And then the third one, though, is monitoring these kinds of protests, monitoring these kinds of events, seeing whether they're growing. I suspect that this won't be the last one of these kinds of protests. It never is. And, is the next one bigger? Is the next one getting more people? Are they gaining momentum? And that's got to be a real concern. And also looking at how emboldened these groups are, and that is slightly different to whether they would gain mass appeal. But one certain level of concern is that these groups are clearly feeling emboldened, and they're clearly feeling that they're willing to engage in violence, and that I think is a level of concern that I believe that security agencies here in Australia are taking much more seriously, as they should be, because that is presenting a real threat of real violence happening in Australia, which we want to avoid at all costs. Oh, I can't hear you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Simon Kaplan is a researcher of the Australian National University. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. That's another episode of Part 8A, and see you again next week. Thank you.